Hello, Netroots Nation. Looks like we're starting to bring folks on. We're going to get started in just a minute. We appreciate all of you who are joining us today for this very exciting and important conversation about making progress on marijuana policy reform in Congress. We're very excited today to be joined by Congressman Earl Blumenauer, as well as Queen Adusui of the Drug Policy Alliance and Jason Ortiz of the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. My name is Justin Streckel, and I am NORML's political director. And NORML is the national organization for the reform of marijuana laws. And we've been around for 50 years working to get people inspired. And it is so wonderful to get to have this conversation with such a broad array of folks who attend Netroots Nation, to have this conversation about how the progressive community can come together and do a better job on pushing this issue forward. So let's go around. We'll do some quick introductions, and then we'll dive into the substance. I'll start with Jason Ortiz. Tell everybody who you are, what you do here.
So my name is Jason Ortiz. I'm the Executive Director for Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which is a 501c3 and C4 nonprofit that helps young people change drug policies in their communities. I'm also someone that was arrested for cannabis when I was younger, and I'm the immediate past president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association.
Thanks, Jason. I know you got a lot of good things to share from the different hats that you've worn. Queen, please tell us a little bit about you and Drug Policy Alliance.
Hey everyone, I'm Queen Adusui, and I'm a policy manager with the Drug Policy Alliance's National Affairs Office in DC. I'm a co-leader of the Marijuana Justice Coalition, which is a federal coalition leading to end marijuana prohibition on the federal level. For folks who are not familiar with the Drug Policy Alliance, we're a national advocacy organization working to end the war on drugs broadly and repair its harms in communities. And I'm really excited to be here.
Great. Thank you, Queen. I see a couple questions coming into the chat. Please make sure, throw your questions in. I'll sprinkle them in as we go through the topics that we have prepared. And Congressman, I'm going to tee up the first question for you to both introduce yourself and your amazing work, because you have been arguably the most tenacious advocate for marijuana policy. You or a founding member of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. Can you tell our panel or tell our audience a little bit about how you approach things and give us just the general state of what's happening on the Hill when it comes to marijuana policy?
Well, thank you, Justin. I'm pleased that Netroots brought us together. Jason and Queen, we worked together on Capitol Hill trying to advance sensible drug policy. It's something that I've been involved with literally for 50 years. I was in the Oregon legislature when we were the first to decriminalize cannabis. And I've been involved at every phase of the process since. I've enjoyed campaigning from Bangor, Maine to Santa Barbara on cannabis reform. I enjoy working with advocates, the industry, and increasingly we're finding people in law enforcement. I mean, it's a wide array of people who understand that it is past time to end our failed prohibition of cannabis and move on in new directions. This has been arguably the most rewarding period that we've had, because while we've watched things take place all across the country, virtually every state, the outlier is the federal government. The federal government has been slow to catch up. But in part with the help of Jason and Queen and other advocates, we've seen more progress at the federal level than ever before. Just this last week, we had the House Judiciary Committee again advance the MORE Act on a bipartisan basis. We are watching in the Senate. I'm really pleased that we've got three champions, friends of mine that I deeply respect. Senator Wyden, the chair of the Finance Committee, an Oregonian who I've watched move forward on this. My dear friend Cory Booker, a champion for racial justice, equity, and about 50 other really important areas. And it's critical that we have Senator Schumer, the majority leader in the US Senate. These three people have introduced the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. I think I got that right. That they're pushing to advance comprehensive reform and restorative justice. To have three well-positioned champions in the Senate moving forward has never happened before. And as I mentioned, we're continuing the progress and the advocacy in the House with the passage again of the MORE Act. We've passed, I want to say, like 5 times efforts to deal with the outrageous prohibition on normal banking relations. This is insidious on several levels. It is a dagger in the heart of people who want to have normalized business activities. It's dangerous. I mean, this, as long as they can't have normal banking arrangements, these facilities are a sitting duck for people who want to inflict violence, robbery. We've had a murder in Portland, and it is not possible, particularly as we're trying to have a broad, diversified base of small and medium-sized businesses, particularly people of color and women. Denying them access to banking services is an expensive impediment for them. We're moving forward with research legislation. I'm just really pleased that work that we've been involved with for decades is coming to a head, broader awareness, and once again, working with the advocates that you'll hear from Jason and Queen, the industry, and people out around the country who are demanding an end to this foolish and dangerous prohibition.
Thank you so very much, Congressman, for setting the foundation of where we're going to take this conversation. And, I just want to make it known for our audience. I've been this in my role at Normal for the last 5 years, and it has been truly a pleasure to work with Congressman Blumenauer and his whole team. And every piece of marijuana-related legislation that is in the Congress has members of Congress calling Earl to make sure that they're approaching this the right way, that they're talking to the right people. And we really can't be, we're just so fortunate to have all of your leadership, Congressman. You brought up the MORE Act, and this truly historic legislation became the first ever bill to end marijuana prohibition to pass in a chamber of Congress when thanks to your leadership and Representative Lee and Chairman Jerry Nadler and the whole Democratic leadership team brought it to the floor. And most of that bill has been copy and pasted into Leader Schumer's bill. So we're really looking forward, at least their discussion draft. So we're looking forward to making sure that your successes in the House are reflected in the Senate. And I know my colleagues here want to talk about it from 2 different lenses, both a reparative justice lens and a future equity lens. So Queen, as policy manager for DPA, can you walk us through some of the reparative justice aspects of the MORE Act and why they're so desperately needed?
Sure, I'm happy to. But before I really get into the reparative justice piece, I also just want to highlight that the MORE Act starts with descheduling, which is like a cornerstone of a marijuana reform, specifically for DPA, just because of the collateral impact of descheduling and the consequences that will still remain if marijuana remains a Schedule I substance. So descheduling, would allow for people who benefit from public benefits to still be able to get that without consequences related to their marijuana use or previous convictions. Descheduling effectively ends federal criminalization. So if marijuana remains on the schedule, there still will be a criminalization attached to marijuana on the federal level. So for us, that's a red line. But in addition to that, the MORE Act also includes several attempts to try to repair the harms of criminalization specifically. So it includes expungement and resentencing. It includes a 5% excise tax on the industry, which is pretty modest given how much the industry now is, responsible for taxes not being recognized as an actual business. So the 5% tax would go to founding the trust fund, which would hold 3 different grant programs. One is a DOJ-led grant program that actually is mirrored from the Marijuana Justice Act. It's a community reinvestment grant, which can be used for any number of resources and services in communities that have been disproportionately affected by over-enforcement and racially biased policing. The other 2 grants are really focused towards trying to influence the industry, particularly in the States, and really impacting folks who are trying to enter the industry. So there is an SBA grant meant to try to allow for economically and socially disadvantaged individuals, which is how we're defining, folks who are impacted by the drug war broadly. But this grant is meant for those folks to be able to reduce the financial barriers to enter the cannabis industry, but also any industry. Because I think this is important to acknowledge that not everyone who is impacted by the drug war wants to be a dispensary owner or wants to be in the industry. And I think it's still important and rightful that, profits of the cannabis industry, are funneled back into communities who are really bore the brunt of criminalization, regardless of their intent or interest of being in the actual cannabis industry. Thirdly, there's a grant meant to try to incentivize states to look into equitable licensing schemes. So the grant would, include, recommendations for states to implement certain, policies that would allow for an industry that isn't inclusive of huge licensing barriers. And that money, again, is to help influence states. One thing to keep in mind is that federal policy can't tell states what to do. So that grant in particular is, one of the important ways that federal reform is allowed to actually influence state policy. So the goal is to influence states to do things like expungement by offering them money to do so. Expungement is expensive, and the expense can become a barrier for states, or at least an excuse for states not to do it. So this grant is helping facilitate equity within the states. And if I can just add on before I pass off the mic, the bill also addresses, like I mentioned, public benefits directly. It includes direct immigration language to make sure that non-citizens are no longer facing immigration consequences because of marijuana convictions or use. It does a really thorough job at really trying to take a look at all the different ways that people are impacted by marijuana's criminalization, and it tries to address those things, which I think is part of an important pathway towards actually addressing prohibition. It's a pathway that DPA and the Marijuana Justice Coalition sees as the rightful and equitable thing to do, just given the marijuana prohibition's unique history and its impact that is still being faced by those who are directly impacted.
No, Queen, that's a lot of different reparative justice that you just talked about, and it's so terrific that we have that many program or that much comprehensively addressed in the MORE Act. Before we switch over to talking about equity in the equity provisions, because I want to give Jason the opportunity to dive in there. Jason or Congressman, do you have any other things that you want to talk about the reparative justice components of the MORE Act?
Let me just briefly say I appreciate Queen walking us through this. What we are contending with is the destructive impact of a 50-year failed and flawed war on drugs, which we lost, the American people lost. But so many aspects of this in terms of prohibition and problems that people have with federal programs that get caught up. It's going to take us a long time to completely unwind this, but that is our commitment. And I appreciate Queen going through a number of these things and dealing with some of the tools that are available. But this is going to be a struggle that we have to be able to try and root out the many areas that the federal government over the course of a half century has inflicted disproportionate, unreasonable harms on people who got caught up in this net.
It's very well put, Congressman. Thank you. Jason, anything before I kick it to you to talk about to lead us on equity programs?
I'll just remind folks that young people specifically were targeted for enforcement in this whole process, and that as we're talking about impacted communities, that definition plays into state level law. So the conversation we have at the federal level, whether or not we're centering restorative justice, and definitely 100% support Queen's position of descheduling has to be the way forward, because there are so many collateral consequences, including access to education or denial of different benefits educationally. So really, we're just taking a very comprehensive look, and I think all the folks that are listening that are working on some of these issues, maybe not directly related to drug policy, hopefully can start to see the connections between basically every facet of society and the efforts of the MORE Act.
Now, Jason just made an important point, and I want to double down on this. Netroots Nation, we love you all. Everyone here comes from such a different perspective, different organizing theories of change, different organizations or groups that you're part of. So we really want all of you to take this information and think about ways that your organizations or your groups can include marijuana justice reforms like those in the MORE Act into your work in the future, and possibly even join us in the Marijuana Justice Coalition. That said, yeah, we want to. Queen touched on some of the grant programs that are funding equity incentives for this emerging legal licensed business or industry. But Jason, as the leader of SSDP, you recently wore the hat, as you mentioned, as the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And if you could just take a moment to walk us through how federal policy could be like that in the MORE Act, could be the game changer needed to influence locally licensed business opportunities for impacted communities.
Sure. And I'll also talk about, as somebody in Connecticut that was one of the leading advocates to legalize in Connecticut, including sitting on the governor's task force to determine the details of licensing. And that whole process has definitely been quite an experience for me, to say the least. But when we're talking about what is possible, right, you're sitting at a table with different policymakers and they say, we can do this or we can't do that. Funding is the bottleneck for basically all of the restorative justice programs. So if there is federal funding available, it is a dramatically different political environment of what we can do. So to be very specific, every state has a different amount of restorative justice. Some have none, some have a lot, but we do have some models we can look to. And I'm going to give a shout out to Oakland, California, and the folks at Supernova Women that were able to get state funding to come to a municipal entity to purchase a building, to be the place where a cohort of equity applicants could all establish their licensing together. Now, that removed the requirement of having a retail location or a real estate location from their needs, making the entrance much, much easier. This is an exact type of program that at the federal level that these grant opportunities do create. The federal government can fund local equity programs. They can use that to rehab, dilapidated buildings nearby to turn into co-op centers. It's pretty endless once there is the funding. So it is something that we want to make sure when we're setting folks up for success, that it is long-term success, it's long-term programs, it's institutions that are built, it's generational change that can only come with a generational level of resources, right, to actually come in there. We all know, though, the cannabis industry is making billions, and so the resources are there. The question is, are we going to, as a community, say, we're going to set aside a certain amount of this to do the right thing? And so I think that's what the MORE Act is doing. It's pushing that conversation. It's making sure we're centering those efforts, and it's giving local communities the ability to start to visualize a new world of what it could be. And so definitely, thank you to the folks in Oregon and California that have really pushed the bar so much higher about what is possible with equity programs, so that when I'm arguing with folks in Connecticut about how to define who should or should not be in the equity programs, I have many other places I can point to that do have successful programs. So the conversation goes from local all the way up to federal, what is possible. And so I think when we're talking about the MORE Act specifically, it does center having that conversation locally, federally, across the board. Now, for myself, as someone that was arrested, we see equity as being the making sure that those who are most impacted by the war on drugs are the chief beneficiaries of the legal marketplace. Now, there's lots of words in there that will need to be defined locally, but that is the basic framework. If we're going to do this, we have to accept the historical context that we're in, repair it. Otherwise, the market will never actually fully be functional, right? Like if we aren't actually incorporating folks into the market, we're just corporatizing cannabis, we're not legalizing it. And so the folks that are currently in the illicit market or the gray market or whatever market you want to call it, that are not paying taxes and aren't regulated, those folks must be a part of the above ground market. We have to make it very easy for those folks to join the above ground market. Right now, there are countless communities that are paying lots of their bills using cannabis sales that have been going on for 100 years. So as we start to figure out how are we going to normalize cannabis use, cannabis possession, cannabis sales in society, those folks should be seen as aspiring entrepreneurs, not folks that are doing something wrong. Because what is happening right now, people are selling tens of thousands of pounds of cannabis, and there are still people in prison over it, right? So we have to make sure we're centering the folks that are trying to make right by their communities to do what they can and give them an on-ramp to the legal industry. How can we do that? Hopefully through federal funding that incentivizes state programs to make it easy for them, right? And so that is where things like safe banking and the MORE Act will radically change the local possibilities when passed.
Could I just jump in just for a second? Because Jason, I really strongly agree with what you're saying. It's so important. But one of the things that, and we're going to fight to have federal resources to help accelerate that. And the framework in the MORE Act and other things we're looking at helps move that forward. But one of the things that I find so exciting about this movement is what's happened at the state and local level. Because there's a lot of power that can be exercised in terms of licensure, for instance, having a market that provides access for smaller operations, priorities given in terms of licensing and opportunities to be in the market that goes to women, people of color, people who have paid the price. We can identify them, and we have a number of examples across the country where at the state and local level, these principles have been applied. And the combination of the creativity at the local level that's helping drive that will help shape the federal policies. A lot of what's in the MORE Act derives from the pressure that is taking place locally. And that tension between the two, I think, is quite exciting because we don't have to wait for federal legislation. We're fighting for it. It will be very important, and we need to end the failed war on drugs. But every minute that passes, there are things we can do to harness this power of the entrepreneurs, of creative state and local officials, and the industry that are committed. And I find that tension kind of exciting.
Oh, that's a very good way to frame it, Congressman. Queen, you want to chime in? And any additional thoughts on the equity opportunities here?
Yeah, I think, one important thing for people to consider is like the opportunity we have with the cannabis industry, like in the beginning stages of the cannabis industry, and the chances we'll have to actually try to mitigate the harms of capitalism and corporatization, and really trying to bring forth the industry that actually has principles, and putting forth guardrails to try to protect the communities that we want to really be benefiting from the industry. And this is not just because, some folks think it's cool. It's really because of the decades of devastating impact that prohibition has had on communities, like tangible impact. People have lost their children because of cannabis laws. People have been deported because of our cannabis laws. Like, people have really experienced devastating impact from our failed marijuana laws, for a plant that really should have never been criminalized in the way that it was to begin with. So I think it's important that we actually, on the forefront of this growing industry, are intentional about inclusion and equity, and make sure that these words are not just buzzwords, but they actually are tangible in policy and are felt in implementation. So I think it's important that on the federal level, federal policymakers are doing what they can to offer incentives to states, especially states who are doing the right thing, and incentivizing states who are not moving yet to do so, but to not step on the toes of folks on the state level who have been for years working towards trying to imagine what post-legalization will look like in their state and / the rest of the country. I think the MORE Act is one of the leading pieces of legislation that addresses criminalization's harm. But I think we're going to talk about this even later on this panel, but we'll also need to really explore regulations and grounding federal cannabis regulations in the same principles that the MORE Act has.
Yeah. No, and I think one thing just to emphasize that all three of you just addressed is that so much of these policies of criminalization and prohibition, the impact is not felt because of federal law enforcement but it's because of local policies. So it's your municipal or your state level law enforcement officers that are giving you those criminal records, that are incarcerating you in local through local court systems. And when it comes to the business side of things, it's state level licensing, local municipal zoning ordinances that need to be addressed. So, with the passage of the MORE Act last December, we're now seeing cannabis advocates and other interested folks around the country going to states, going to city councils, and saying, this is where Congress is heading. This is the trajectory they're going. So implement a more equitable system from the start, so that way we'll be better positioned to take advantage of these new funding streams and incentives once Congress does finally get that bill across the finish line and to the president's desk for his signature. So considering these justice and equity implications, Congressman Blumenauer, I'm going to ask you to start. Can you speak to how those kind of broad goals could be thought of by participants of Netroots and how they could be thinking creatively to engage their members in localities and states around the country, and point to the MORE Act and your work as a good example to get ready for that victory?
Well, I cannot emphasize enough the impact of grassroots advocacy has had on reforming drug policy. I mean, for years, the only areas that we saw reform at the state and local levels came through the ballot box. It wasn't something that primarily was driven by politicians. It was by advocates and people who cared deeply about it. That principle continues to apply. And in fact, some of the things that Jason and Quinn were talking about have more impact locally. I hope that people keep the drumbeat up, working with local prosecutors. There are a number of we're still arresting or citing hundreds of thousands of people a year for something that most Americans think should be entirely legal. And these are decisions, as you mentioned, Justin, that are made locally. Being able to make sure that we're working with local law enforcement to not use low-level cannabis activity as a pretext to hassle people. Some of the most egregious cases that we've seen of police violence this last year started out as drug busts that went wrong. Well, that is something we can deal with locally to change these policies. And then there are areas that have such broad bipartisan support. I've been working on medical cannabis for years. This is something that's like the 4th of July. It is broadly supported, and it is an important part of dealing with the healthcare inequities that we've seen. If we had had broader access to medical cannabis, we would have saved thousands of lives that fell victim to opioid overdose deaths. In fact, we know that states that have a robust medical marijuana program have fewer opioid deaths. It's cheaper, it's safer, and these are things that we can work with you in the advocacy space to be able to advance. Right now, 98% of the American public has access to some form of legalized cannabis. And we need people to recognize what that is and to continue their advocacy group advance to be able to make that case at the state and local level, which will accelerate the progress. I mean, any state that has money that they collect with cannabis taxes, virtually all of them do, well, there are opportunities to repurpose that. In Oregon, we just made a decision in the last election to decriminalize hard drugs and to put the emphasis on treatment, not law enforcement. And these are things that Netroots can help us beat this drum, make this case, and to be able to accelerate the progress. It'll make more success at the federal level faster.
No, absolutely. Thank you for all of that, Congressman. And I know you have another commitment, so you only have another minute to stay with us. But I know that you've been we've mainly been talking about cannabis policy, but I know that you've been talking more and more recently about the broader war on drugs and other substances. So I'd love to just turn it over to you just to give a few more thoughts on drug policy in general.
You need to hear from Jason and Queen. They have lots of important things to say. But let me just say, I am proud that Oregon was the first state to decriminalize cannabis. But we just passed a statewide ballot measure with over 55% that made the determination that we were going to decriminalize other drugs, the so-called hard drugs. They're not legalized, but we decriminalize how we treat people, and we are investing more of the cannabis resources in treatment to help people who have a substance abuse disorder. They don't need to be threatened with jail. They need to have help. And we're actually starting down a path with psilocybin research to have an opportunity for expanding opportunities with the so-called psychedelics. Have tremendous potential for therapy in the future for a whole host of disorders. So I just want to say that I'm proud that at least my state is looking at the bigger picture, and that both these measures were strongly supported by the public, not so much by the politicians, but advocacy groups like the Drug Policy Alliance, like Students for Sensible Drug Policy, NORML, helped set the stage. And I think there's amazing progress that awaits us if we follow through on it.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for all of that, and just everything that you've done to help us get to this point where comprehensive federal reform, we see the top of the mountain now, and we're getting closer every day. Any other thoughts before you have to hop off?
I'm standing up a bunch of people on a Zoom call. I apologize, but I need to switch here.
No, thank you so very much, Earl. We'll talk to you soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Queen. Thank you, Jason.
All right. So Queen Jason, same question. Let's take a moment to talk about the broader war on drugs, and then we're going to bring in our video from Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but I think that'll be a good way to lead her in. So I'll kick it over to Queen first.
Cool. And before I touch on that, I just wanted to offer that I really want to uplift what Congressman Blumenauer was saying around just like the actual impact on patients and people who live with debilitating conditions, who, because of prohibition, for whatever reasons, has barriers to being able to access a medicine. I think that's an understated impact of the drug war. The pain and suffering that people have to deal with because they may lose their job or their kids because they're not able to actually make the choice that they want to make related to their health. Because again, marijuana, cannabis is a medicine. And I think that's a huge distinction that needs to be recognized as we talk about marijuana reform. But onto broader drug war issues, it's really important to me that the sentiments that are now really being shared in a bipartisan way around marijuana are extended to all other substances, because we're living through a really terrifying overdose crisis that's only been worsened by the COVID-19 crisis. But frankly, the overdose crisis has been really terrible for decades at this point. And I think it's the impact of the overdose crisis has to be considered a public health emergency. And, considering that this year is the 50th anniversary of the drug war, I think it's about time that we really evaluate what we want the next 50 years to look like. And, there are policymakers who say, and even the president has casually said, that people who use drugs and people who struggle with drug misuse should not be in jail. It's a public health issue. It's a behavioral health issue. So we should treat it that way. There's no reason why we should be incarcerating people for drug use. I mean, I think this is something that actually came up during the markup of the MORE Act, where we had GOP members, saying so passionately about how incarceration works, how incarceration is a strategy to try to, address overdose and people's issues with drug misuse. And it's just a flagrant lie that incarceration works. It's really offensive at this point to even suggest that, given all of the evidence, the abundant amount of evidence that shows that incarceration does nothing but worsen the impacts of, chaotic drug use and prohibition broadly. So for me, I was really grateful to see both Representative Cori Bush and Bonnie Watson-Coleman lead the introduction of the first federal drug decriminalization bill in Congress, the Drug Policy Reform Act. And this is a bill that would remove criminal penalties for personal use drug possession, including the founding of a commission on substance use, health and safety that would establish what personal use benchmarks are for each substance. But this commission, is comprised of, I think, people who should be involved in that conversation of, establishing what personal use is for each substance. I think we need to get beyond the strategy of going substance by substance when we're trying to address the drug war, because it's not going to end well in terms of really making sure that we're protecting our brothers and sisters and siblings who use substances that are still really stigmatized. Cannabis is still stigmatized, of course, but, it still benefits from, cultural understandings of its benefits and a growing acceptance of, its health benefits, which I think has been really helpful in its reform movement. But the real way to actually end the entire drug war and uproot its harms is by addressing all substances and not delineating between soft and hard, which is another conversation. But yeah, I'll pass it to Jason.
But I would encourage, just take a moment to plug drugpolicy.org.
Mm-hmm.
The Drug Policy Alliance is an amazing resource. If any of y'all haven't ever been to their website, now is the time to open it up, bookmark it, go back to it after this panel. All right, Jason, ssdp.org.
Make sure you bookmark that one too, and check out our blog, because actually just yesterday we announced that we have released a model decriminal municipal resolution. And so this effort was many folks coming together to figure out the best way that we could get right to the root of the problem, eliminate the flawed policy, and replace it with science, reason, and compassion-based programs. So anyone in the country can take this policy, but it's specifically for our young people to be able to move a little bit off campus into the city halls, wherever they live, and really have this conversation in the context of their local environment. And each locality is going to be very different, right? The city council of New York is going to be very different than the city council of New London, Connecticut. But this provides every organizer a tool to start the conversation and to be able to build coalitions to figure out what the post-prohibition world looks like. SSDP is end prohibition, end the war on all drugs, and end the war on all of our communities, because the war is on our communities. And we want to make sure we do it once and for all, right? Prohibition is a failed policy. Now, that's the local level. As we start to work at state levels and federal levels, there are countless other ways that we've been moving to try to reduce the impact of the war on drugs. This is where I think a lot of the Netroots Nation listeners can come in, is to find where their particular policies or efforts or organizations or goals are being impacted by drug policy. One thing that has become very apparent to us, the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, which is a federal policy, is providing an excuse for many universities to not update their policies to include harm reduction efforts for their students, right? This is quite literally just denying them knowledge and information about how to interact with substances that exist. And this is something in 2021, we're still having to struggle with administrations just to let young people know what it is that they're doing, that they're already doing. So all the way from really talking to our mayors and city councils, implementing programs, to the federal Department of Education, there's so much work we have to do. And if we take it drug by drug, it'll take centuries, right? There's more drugs than I think any of us really realize, right? That are out there. It's literally impossible to do it one drug at a time. So what we really need to be talking about is what is not working that we need to eliminate, and what is the better policy to replace it. We replace everything with harm reduction, right? Any approach to a policy, does this actually reduce the harm to the people it's affecting in their community, or is it adding to right? Incarceration and using violence, the police, to resolve a mental health situation is adding violence to that situation. We want to give folks the ability to leave a violent situation, get the help that they need, and the information and knowledge of how to exist in society. And I think right now we're seeing the psychedelic movement burgeoning. And while I do believe there is tremendous power in psychedelic therapy, the possession of psychedelics, the use of psychedelics, even outside of therapeutic contexts, should not be criminalized, right? And so that's like for SSDP, for many of the folks in the movement, home grow, personal cultivation, personal use of your own time is part of equity, in my opinion. And so here in Connecticut, we had to fight very hard to make sure home grow is included just on cannabis. But luckily, on October 1st, medical patients can now grow cannabis in their homes legally. So it is something that very small incremental changes can have a huge impact on the results of the policy. So I want us to not think of it just as like one federal bill or like there's one thing we have to work on. We really have to examine the tentacles the war on drugs has gone in our community and then find where we can personally undo that piece of it. Because the closer we get to no longer being reliant on violence and incarceration, the easier transitioning to the new world is going to be.
So are you to suggest that marijuana legalization is the gateway reform
I
to
have
broader
been
harm
known
reduction?
to say that, and I think it's really helpful to see in cannabis policy, right, just how many different laws were enacted with cannabis or marijuana or drug policy in their name, because you will understand why an end the war on all drugs approach is the only way to really do this in an efficient and effective manner.
Queen, I know you want to jump in with one more thing here.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer one more point around, actual support on this, like the initiatives that we're bringing up around drug decriminalization. So DPA and ACLU worked on instituting a poll that was released earlier this year that showed that 63% of American voters support removing criminal penalties for drug possession. And even higher than that, 83% of American voters believe that the war on drugs has failed. And I find it hard to find, many issues where 83% of Americans agree on the same thing. So I think it's abundantly clear that, people are there when it comes to, the fact that we need to change our drug policies. So it's time that we push policymakers to stand in line with us and stop avoiding reform. But just one call also to especially justice reform minded partners and attendees of Netroots. Drug possession is one of the most arrested offenses. It's one of the leading arrested offenses. And there's no way to, have conversations about defunding the police or police reform or trying to reduce the impact around law enforcement contact in communities of color without talking about decriminalizing drugs, first and foremost, in addition to other offenses, including sex work and other crimes of poverty. So I think it's important that, folks who may not, work with drug policy or work on drug policy on their day-to-day, consider how drug policy reform is so intersectional and it touches on so many other issues. So whether you're a housing advocate, whether you're an anti-poverty advocate, whether you work with sex workers, whether you work with LGBTQ communities, all of our work also includes the drug war because it's been so insidious and it's touched on so many things. So we really need to work in solidarity and break down silos in order to be effective in our decimating of the drug war.
Well, so we'll pivot from there. Thank you, Queen. So we got a number of great questions that have come into the chat. If you have any more for our panelists, please put them in now. And then we're gonna kick it over. Don, if you could bring up the video from Representative Barbara Lee, and we will play this, and then we'll get to your questions. All right, I think I might have accidentally messed up with the audio, so I'm going to give this one more shot. Let's try that one more time.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today and for holding this very important discussion on cannabis justice. For years, our broken, discriminatory cannabis policy has disproportionately harmed communities of color. I know you know this. The war on drugs is just another extension of the legacy of systemic racism that all of us, including myself, are fighting each and every day to dismantle. I'm working so hard alongside my Congressional Cannabis Caucus co-chair, my good friend Congressman Blumenauer, to end the war on drugs and start providing restorative justice to communities most impacted. And yes, we've made more progress over the last two sessions of Congress than ever before. As you all know, last year, the House passed the MORE Act. The MORE Act, which includes my Marijuana Justice Act, is the most comprehensive cannabis legislation to date. This year, yes, we're on track to build off of our momentum. The MORE Act just passed out of the Judiciary Committee and is making its way to the floor. We are working diligently with our Senate colleagues to finally send the bill to the president's desk for a signature. It is so crucial that we not only end the failed war on drugs, but take steps to repair the damage by investing in Black and Brown communities that bore the brunt of these policies. This includes expunging records, addressing inequalities in the legal cannabis marketplace, and ensuring equal participation in the industry. We are closer than we've ever been before to turning the page on our harmful cannabis policy. And so, yes, I'm confident that with partners like you all, we will get it done. Thank you so much for all of the work that you do. Let's keep up the fight. I'll turn now back over to Justin to continue the conversation.
The Barbara Lee, as they say in Oakland, Barbara Lee speaks for me, and I think that's certainly true. And Don, if you could take out the video from the share. So I'm so sad Representative Lee couldn't join us live today. Being a member of Congress, schedules are a little bit ebbs and flows, but the Congresswoman did this panel with us a couple years ago at Netroots in Philadelphia. And, just for context on Representative Lee and to expand on some of the things she just said, she is a co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus along with Representative Blumenauer. And it's actually a bipartisan caucus. And they have done an incredible job of creating the space for Republicans who are willing to evolve on this issue to be armed with the ability of how to do so. And that's why when the MORE Act passed on the floor of the House last December, it included votes from 6 elected Republicans. There's a certain member of Congress from Florida whose name I don't say publicly because I don't provide him platform. But you might be able to guess who this is. My colleagues know. But he once described the MORE Act as a perpetual reparations machine, and then he voted for the bill. So so that being said, like there is ways to go forward, and I certainly hope that all of you who stand for these values can think about ways to answer Barbara Lee's call, answer Earl Blumenauer's call, answer our calls, work with us to get these things done. So that said, I want to answer a couple of your questions that you've posed, and really thoughtful ones. The first one, I'll open it up to whoever wants to jump in. Is from Nicole. Would love to hear your thoughts on California and how the illicit cannabis market continues to surpass the legal market. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that is and what you think is going to happen? Jason.
Because the unregulated market was always bigger than the regulated market. And so it's only been a few years since the legal marketplace has even been accessible at all. And so when we're taking a multi-billion-dollar community program that cannabis sales have been to provide resources for folks and families, and then try to corporatize it, it's not going to go over well unless those communities are brought into that program. And so in the places where those communities have been given easier on-ramps, there is a better relationship between unlicensed operators and the current space. But we've also seen commercial operators make it very difficult for those individuals to get into the cannabis industry, creating animosity and proving a lot of the concerns correct that over-corporatization of cannabis is not going to result in a perpetual reparations machine that I would like to see passed. And that's a good way to put it. I bet he voted for it because it's a good idea. So I don't think the goal is to totally eliminate folks that are operating unlicensed, right? The goal is to reduce any kind of interactive harm between the law enforcement officials and folks in our communities so that people can continue to live long, happy lives. And so part of this question, I feel like, is a bit of a misalignment of goals, right? The goal isn't to eliminate them. The goal is to bring them above board. And the places that you see making an effort to do that are doing better at it. The places that are trying to push those folks out will continue to have an unregulated market until they bring in those operators.
Right. Queen, you got something to add to that?
I just wanted to offer some grace even to, the folks who are leading social equity efforts in the States, because they're literally building a plane while flying it. And like, there are lessons learned as the process goes that I think other jurisdictions that are legalizing after are able to learn from. And it's just a continued learning experience. Like, this is literally an experiment grounded in good faith. So, I mean, I think it's important that we're even having the conversation about social equity in states, including in California, where I know some folks have opinions about how successful social equity has been in California. And there's merits to both sides that I think I've heard. But again, I think it's important that we're actually trying to do this versus just having an industry, being born the way what really was in the original years of the first legalizing states. It's important to give folks grace as we literally try to navigate an uncharted territory. But I think, we're doing a better job as states continue to legalize now that we actually have some years in with lessons learned.
And I think if we just refer to them as aspiring entrepreneurs and ask, why aren't these aspiring entrepreneurs successful? We'll have radically different policies. And so I think if we look at it that way, we'll be more effective at it.
Or unregulated entrepreneurs.
Sure.
How can we bring these unregulated entrepreneurs into the legal market? All right, so we got 10-minute warning. So we're gonna do speed answers now, because I know y'all got some stuff, a couple more thoughts you would definitely want to share, but I want to get these questions. So June asks, with all the states that have legalized recreational marijuana use have caused for issues people living in public or Section 8 housing, people are getting evicted. I say this as a TA president. When will Congress act to end this? Queen, you want to hit that?
Sorry, Jason, can you go ahead and answer that?
When will Congress end it? I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I can say that we're pushing.
It broke out. I didn't hear the question.
No. So the MORE Act has a provision that guarantees public benefits are to be protected by people who consume cannabis. So there would still be the opportunity for those who landlords who allow people to use Section 8. They could say it's a non-smoking household, but they can't evict you for possession inside of the house. And through other public housings, people would be protected. This is a pernicious thing. I want to shout out. We've seen our advocates, Normal in Illinois and Chicago, have been working really, really hard radicalizing their Chicago area congressional delegation. And it's a really big issue, but yeah, the MORE Act would address that problem. So Josh, Jason.
No, and then also fight for it at the state level, because your state laws have to get changed as well.
Yes. So Joshua says, work for the UFCW, which is a seed to sale cannabis union. How can labor support these changes and vice versa? How can these reforms help out organized labor?
I think I see more of that effort happening when we start having conversations about regulations. And by regulations, I mean like that is how the federal government will try to approach regulating cannabis on the federal level. So, ensuring that labor laws are protected is going to be a part of that conversation. but also instituting that on the local level. The MORE Act doesn't necessarily have those protections as it is now, but I think that's a conversation that will be had in the Senate side as they figure out the bill that will be introduced.
At the state level in Connecticut, we actually work very closely with UFCW. So shout out to Aiden Coffey from the international, Emily Sabo from the local, because we ran our legalization bill through the labor committee, actually, to make sure that we had things like labor peace agreements. That's usually the number one way that we can make sure we're working together, is that whatever the new industry is created, solid jobs with benefits and long-term career advancement, right? The other way is that the unions can create pathways to prosperity, is what we call it in Connecticut, where we create apprenticeship programs funded by the state funds, funded through cannabis legalization efforts that have an on-ramp very specifically for highly trained jobs that then can go into either equity applicants, which would be a really cool way to do it, or the general industry. So I think both on leveraging the power that labor unions have to pass or block bad policy at the state level and using cannabis revenue to create pathways for folks to be in the industry is a very, very clear way that we can work together and bring labor and equity to the table to create programs that'll last forever.
Solidarity forever. No, and shout out to UFCW National, who is a member of the Marijuana Justice Coalition and has been a really terrific ally. So if you're in organized labor, the union should be on the front lines of this fight. There are over 321,000 jobs in the entire cannabis legal ecosystem. Those can be good paying jobs if we make sure that they are. Because unfortunately, we see too many cannabis companies that are now licensed still paying low wages, not providing workers benefits, not giving them certainty in their schedules. The list goes on. So that's one way. It's a really ripe industry for labor to engage with. Let's see. Okay, if you got any other questions, please drop them in the chat now, and we'll get to them before we wrap. But we are getting close, and I know this is something that I'm really excited just to let Queen and Jason riff, because we were talking about this before. There's a lot of nuance when we get into the nitty gritty of these reforms, and when when we talk about legalization, when we talk about decriminalization, and we talk about medicalization. So I just want to turn it over, Jason and Queen, first person to start talking, just to get the first crack at it. Talk to our audience about how they should be thinking, what they need to know about the nuance of these three different approaches or lenses.
I would say, just to briefly define what these terms actually mean, because they technically are different things. Decriminalization speaks to removing criminal penalties for a substance, but it doesn't do anything else beyond that in terms of like setting up legal access to the substance, or formally or publicly regulating the substance. So it's kind of like the bare bones of just removing criminal penalties, so people are no longer arrested for it. And when folks were looking to decriminalize marijuana alone, the idea is that that's not enough. New York is a good case study for that. New York decriminalized marijuana in the 70s. And I grew up in New York, in the Bronx, and you could not tell that marijuana was decriminalized because of, the way that decriminalization is not enough. So at least for marijuana, we want to see legal access to the plant. We want to see equitable access to a regulated substance. Legalization is, legalizing a plant and allowing for legal regulations and access to the plant for adult use. And that, for us carries a lot of benefits, public health benefits, public safety benefits, access to youth, which is an issue for a lot of folks, making sure that it's age restricted. All of that comes through regulations.
And I would just speak to the process that comes in actually defining these words in policy. And that is where, again, Netroots Nation folks can support the equity advocates in their local communities as the people that get to decide what equity means. Here in Connecticut, I fought very directly with the governor's office on the definition of equity on the space of who are the communities that are most impacted. We had months and months of arguments of whether or not people with criminal histories for cannabis should be included in the equity programs for cannabis. I ended up losing that fight. We did not get the people with criminal histories in there because I didn't do a good enough job centering the folks that, in my opinion, were directly impacted. If you were arrested or incarcerated for a cannabis crime, you were directly impacted. And now our equity program is geographic and has no racial component to it whatsoever. So in that fight, had there been more folks that said, I don't think the billionaire governor should be defining the word equity, I think it should be the folks that are most impacted, we'd have a different program today. So the definition of what words mean, this is policy, like the beginning of any policy, being able to articulate that and having the power to make it the final definition. That is one piece that I think most activists sort of understate going into this, that other folks can hijack their words and change their meanings, right? So as a progressive movement, as the broader folks that want to see justice in society, we have to be really firm on what these words mean and what they don't mean and what our goals are, because there's many contexts while folks claiming we're all on the same page, operating for very different interests. And at the end of the day, there has to be a definition for these words, and those who are more powerful will often be able to do that unless we bring the heat and bring the messaging from the beginning that the purpose of legalization is to repair the damage done by our government to very specific people and communities, right? While I want to make sure we tax the big corporations, the states are the ones that incarcerated everyone. And so as we move forward, if we're creating a program to help folks that were impacted, people with criminal histories must be a part of that. And we have to make sure that that is a foundation of all of our equity work moving forward in every state house, in every municipal government, in every city council, and in Congress, that those are the folks we're here to restore and to bring back to some sense of balance after what's happening, not to make sure that lots of people can get lots of money. I support people licensing and getting in businesses. It's a big part of restorative justice and economic justice. That being said, we cannot lose sight of the purpose of all of this work is to get folks out of prison and to stop putting people in there. So I just want to make sure that when we think about definitions of words, that we stand strong on some of these that seem simple, but at the end of the day, we'll have radical consequences depending on how we specifically define it.
And if I can just add, I do think that, we should include families of people who have been incarcerated in the conversation about equity, just because of the impact that it has on families, as well as folks who grew up in really devastating in communities that were devastated by over enforcement, because those have serious impact on a person's economic opportunity.
No, well, we are now out of time. We could have gone on for a couple more hours just on those three words and talking about how the battles have played out in Congress, how they played out in states and municipalities. I want to express my true appreciation to both of my colleagues, and just lift them up. It has been, we would not have gotten the MORE Act done if not for, or to get a bill passed last Congress, if not for these two individuals and a handful of others, mostly the staffers for Representatives Earl Blumenauer and Barbara Lee.
You too, Justin.
Yeah,
you too. Hello.
I did some things. So again, Jason Ortiz, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, ssdp.org, Queen Adusui, Drug Policy Alliance, drugpolicy.org, Justin Streckel, normal.org. Get on our email lists, get in communication. Netroots has tweeted out our Twitter handles. Get at us. If your organization, if you as an activist want to get engaged on this, all three of us will take your call. We will all have a conversation with you about ways that your organization could and or should be getting engaged and more importantly, how you're going to be most effective when you choose to get engaged and be in alliance with all of us as well. So thank you, Netroots. Always love and solidarity. Y'all have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you in person, hopefully in the near future.